You never forget the first time you hear a scream behind a closed tavern door. It wasn't the kind of scream that signals danger. No, it was the kind that rides the back of laughter, ragged and raw. The kind that makes you wonder what kind of madness is unfolding inside and whether you belong out here in the rain or in there, where the wild things are. Bruges, 1374. You arrived with your boots soaked, your coin pouch light, and your heart heavier than your pack. A storm had rolled through like an argument. No one was winning. Thunder had receded, but the wind lingered like a bitter aftertaste, dragging your coat back with every step. They told you to follow the noise. That's how you'd find it. No signs, no maps. Listen, said a merchant, with teeth too perfect to be honest. Where the town breathes too loud for night, that's your place. And he wasn't wrong. The town itself felt like a dream fraying at the edges. Windows blinked amber through warped glass. Wooden signs swayed in agony above cracked doors. Some alleys looked like they hadn't seen sunlight since kings were kind. Others whispered things you weren't ready to understand. You moved with purpose, but no direction. Your ears were your compass. Somewhere beyond the blacksmith's forge, past a woman shouting about onions and an elderly man trying to sell a single boot, you heard it. The unmistakable rhythm of mugs on wood, voices climbing over each other like children fighting for attention. And music, if you could call it that, blaring from a stringed instrument that sounded like it was losing a battle with itself. You followed it, even when the sensible part of you urged otherwise. Something primal pushed you forward. Curiosity, hunger, loneliness, hope. Then you saw it. The building leaned so hard it looked like it was drunk on its own foundation. The wood was weathered, blistered by 1,000 winters. The windows glowed with a reddish hue, as if fire wasn't just inside the hearth, but licking the walls themselves. And above the door swung a wooden sign faded beyond recognition. You stared at it, trying to decipher the crude paintwork. Was it a barrel, a bear, or some unfortunate attempt at both? This was not a place that welcomed you with open arms. It stared at you, dared you to knock or run. The door had a handle iron-wrought and cruelly cold. Your fingers hesitated. The storm behind you had passed, but the one inside was just beginning. You weren't just stepping into a tavern. You were stepping into a different world, a parallel realm where rules shifted and memories were stitched together with laughter, blood, and mead. You opened the door, and the sound swallowed you whole. It was like stepping into the lungs of something enormous and alive. The heat slammed into you, thick, smoky, and laced with the scent of roasted meat and spilled humanity. Conversations crashed together like waves, drowning your thoughts. You couldn't tell where one voice ended and another began, and in that chaos, a strange silence formed inside you, a clarity. You were no longer alone. Eyes glanced up, then dismissed you, just as quickly. This wasn't a place where anyone announced your arrival. If you wanted to exist here, you had to make space for yourself. No welcome committee, no kind nods, just elbows, spilled ale, and stories waiting to be told. A man near the door burped, so loudly it rattled the lantern. No one flinched. You stepped forward. The straw beneath your boots was damp, absorbing not just rainwater, but every step taken here before you. The floor, if you could call it, that was a patchwork of earth, wood, and regrets. Smoke clung to the beams like forgotten prayers, dancing lazily in the candlelight. The hearth roared from the far end of the room, its flames casting wild shadows that gave everything a heartbeat. A bard played something in the corner, his eyes closed, his song halfway between heartbreak and nonsense. A couple argued over a spilled drink, then laughed as if that were the point all along. A dog gnawed a bone beneath a table, ignoring the foot it rested on. You didn't belong, not yet, but you would, because this place didn't care who you were, it cared what you could survive. You walked to the bar, heart pounding. No menus, no servers, just a woman with arms like tree trunks and eyes like sharpened stone. She poured a drink without asking and pushed it toward you. You didn't know what it was. You didn't ask. You drank. It was bitter, too warm, possibly dangerous, and it was perfect. This was it, the heart of medieval life. Not the palace, not the cathedral, the tavern, where the dirty, divine, broken, bold, foolish, and fearless all came to eat, argue, sing, gamble, love, weep, fight, tend, sleep under a bench if needed. You weren't just visiting history, you were living inside its lungs. And trust me, this is only the beginning. Before we dive deeper into this chaotic, beautiful, ale-soaked journey through time, I want to ask for one small thing. If you're enjoying this story, if you want more nights around smoky hearths, wild songs, mysterious strangers, and history that makes you feel, then please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It's free, it's easy, and it helps us bring more medieval magic to your nights. And now, for a bit of fun before the next chapter, let's see how closely you've been listening. Which of these sounds was your first clue that the tavern was nearby? A. Someone singing about a pig. B. The blacksmith shouting about onions. Comment below with your answer, A or B, and let's see who's paying attention in the shadows. Ready for what comes next? You've had your first drink, but the real stories begin when the door closes behind you. The door groaned closed behind you like the last breath of the storm, and just like that, the world changed. Outside, the night had been wet, cold, and uncertain. Inside, the tavern was immediate and unapologetic. You didn't enter a room. You entered a rhythm. It hit you first, not in sight, but in sound. There was no single conversation to follow, no melody to isolate. Instead, the voices layered like waves in a restless sea. They rose and fell, unpredictably, shouts, howls, laughter, accusations, toasts, songs, whispers, until they all became one crashing chorus of life. Then came the heat. Not just from the hearth at the far end, which roared with an unrelenting hunger, but from bodies pressed close. From open mouths breathing ale and stories, from the candle-stubbed tables and the smoke-stained rafters above, that trapped every scent and sound like a memory too stubborn to leave. You stood still, unsure if your entrance had made you visible, but if anyone noticed, they didn't show it. The tavern was too busy being itself to concern itself with new blood. To your left, a trader with a braided beard was cackling into his mug, crumbs tumbling from his lips. He slapped the back of a scribe who hadn't spoken in minutes, as if laughter alone could baptize friendship. To your right, a young woman in a faded cloak nursed a cider, like it was the last comfort in her world. Behind her, two guards in dented mail argued over whose sword was duller. Their dispute bordered on affection. There were no private tables, no velvet booths or quiet alcoves. Every space was open, every seat shared. You didn't earn privacy, and here you surrendered to the collective breath of the room. You didn't sit alone unless you wanted questions or trouble. You moved slowly, taking it in. The floor was packed earth with straw thrown over it, like an afterthought. It muffled footsteps and soaked up every spill of drink, stew, or something worse. The ceiling pressed down with thick beams, some too low for taller men who stooped automatically, like veterans of this wooden battlefield. One of the beams had names carved into it, some fresh, some old, all unreadable, but they felt like ghosts. Near the hearth, a bard sat on a stool too short for his frame, plucking at a lute with 3 working strings. His voice was soft, hopeful, and absolutely drowned out by the chaos. No one listened. No one asked him to stop. At the bar, if it could be called that, a long, warped plank of wood rested atop barrels. Behind it stood Hilda, the same woman who'd handed you that first nameless drink. Her sleeves were rolled high, and her arms moved like machines. Mug, refill, slam, coin, repeat. But her eyes, they saw everything. Every hand that reached too far, every whisper spoken too loud, every secret not quite hidden. No one gave her orders. She gave none aloud, and yet the tavern obeyed. And still, no one had asked who you were. That was the strangest thing. No questions, no greetings, not yet. Here, you didn't introduce yourself, you revealed yourself slowly. One glance, one gamble, one story at a time. Someone bumped into you, hard. You turned, ready for insult or apology. Instead, a grin, no words, just a raised mug. The unspoken language of this place. You raised yours in return. You noticed something else then, the air. It wasn't just thick with smoke and the scent of yeast. It was alive with history. You could almost hear the echoes of last night, last week, last winter. Someone had sung a lullaby in that far corner. Someone had cried into the bar where your hand now rested. Someone had fallen in love, pretended to at that very bench. The walls held it all, and you realized this wasn't just a place to drink. It was a crucible, a testing ground. You came in one kind of person, but you wouldn't leave the same. You hadn't even sat down yet, but the tavern had already begun to shape you. Its fire reached into your chest. Its noise curled around your thoughts, and its chaos whispered something strangely comforting. You're not lost here. You're just unfinished. Welcome to the inside. Now, let's see who you become. The first sip always told the truth. It didn't matter who you were before you crossed the threshold into that tavern. Didn't matter what battles you fought on the road, or what secrets followed behind you like shadows. When that mug hit your lips, when that warm, yeasty bitterness rolled across your tongue, you were someone new, or maybe someone more honest than you'd been in years. The drink didn't care about your name, neither did the food, but they did remember your silence, your hunger, your reverence, and here, that was enough. The mug in your hand was rough clay, mismatched with the rest on the table. It may have once been a soup bowl, or a candle holder, or a weapon. Now, it was your companion. The ale inside was thick and unfiltered, the color of riverbed silt, with floating specks that moved when you breathed too hard. It wasn't cold, because there was no ice. It wasn't clear, because nothing in this world really was. But it was real. You sipped, braced for regret and tasted survival. It was bitter at first, then herbal, almost sweet at the back. Like someone had tried to mask a bad decision with honey, and failed just enough to be honest. But it warmed your chest. It anchored your hands. It made your ribs feel like they might finally stop clenching against the world. Not bad, said a voice beside you. Hilda didn't look at you as she spoke, just wiped down a mug with a cloth that could have been a battle relic. You didn't spit. That's a good sign. You asked her what was in it. She laughed once. Depends on the barrel. Depends on the day. Depends who annoyed me when I brewed it. And just like that, you understood this wasn't cuisine. It was ritual. The stew came next. No order placed. No menu read. Just a thud on the table, and a puff of steam that carried the essence of every meal you'd ever loved or feared. Pot, they called it. A slow-cooked mixture of root vegetables, grains, broth, and meat if meat was available and generous enough to identify itself. Tonight's offering was thick, heavy with barley, and dotted with carrot stubs and something grayish that might have once bleeded. You took a spoonful. It burned your tongue in a comforting way. The bread beside it was hard enough to defend yourself with, but after a dunk in the stew, it softened into something resembling sustenance. The tavern didn't serve meals. It delivered necessity, and in doing so, it gave something deep, piece of belonging. Around you, others ate and drank with different rhythms. A merchant spooned stew between tales of an impossible deal in Prague. A woman in a wool cloak dipped bread into cider, her eyes closed like the warmth might carry her back to someone lost. A cluster of farmers clanked mugs in a toast to the first harvest moon, then argued over whose ale caused fewer blisters. The drinks came in more varieties than names. Mead, golden and dangerously smooth, was passed in ceramic jugs to chipped to stack. Cider smelled like regret and orchard wind. Even water, scarce and suspect, had to be boiled or blessed or fermented into safety. Hilda, ever watchful, kept a rhythm behind the bar. She poured, refilled, judged, forgave, all in silence, save for the occasional grunt or biting quip. Every so often, she'd reach beneath a counter and retrieve a special mug thicker, older, blackened at the rim and hand it off with a nod that meant, "You've earned this," or maybe, "You need it more than most." You noticed how no one ever drank alone, not truly. Even the quietest souls found their place in the symphony of eating and drinking. A shared pot, a borrowed mug, a passed jug. These weren't just acts of survival. They were offerings, admissions, invitations. This place didn't ask for your best self. It accepted what you had left at the end of the day, and gave you back a little more. And somewhere in the firelight, between the heat of the stew and the dull ache of the ale, you felt your shoulders drop. You stopped flinching at shadows. You stopped counting your coins. You were here, and that was enough. You don't rule a place like this with volume. You rule it with presence. With the kind of silence that makes even the drunkest man remember his manners. And no one understood that better than Hilda. She didn't sit on a throne. She didn't wear a crown. But make no mistakes, she ruled that tavern. Her bar was her battlefield. Her gaze, her gavel, her ladle, as effective as any sword. You watched her long before you dared speak again. She moved like someone who had once run from something terrible and had decided never to run again. Every gesture she made, pouring a mug, cleaning a spill, tossing out a lewd comment with a grin sharper than any blade, was deliberate, grounded, unmistakably hers. No one challenged her, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Even the brashest mercenary or the loudest drunk softened their tone around her, as if the very wood of the bar might snap in protest if her rules were broken. And what were those rules? They weren't written on parchment. They weren't posted on the walls. But everyone who stayed long enough learned them. You could drink until you forgot your name, but you didn't put hands where they didn't belong. You could argue, shout, sing off-key, but you left your blade in its sheath. You could come in broken, bitter, wild, but you left better. Or you didn't come back at all. Hilda didn't shout her rules. She lived them, enforced them with a single raised brow, or the sudden, heavy thud of her boot when someone crossed the invisible line. She didn't tolerate cruelty. She didn't permit arrogance. And she didn't repeat herself. And yet, she wasn't cruel. You saw it in the small things, the way she slipped a chunk of bread into the pocket of a beggar pretending to drink. The way she nodded toward the bard even when his songs fell flat. The way she watched Ren, her boy assistant, without ever coddling, but never ignoring. She protected him without saying the word. She gave him tasks, trusted him with coin, sent him home early when the hearth grew too wild. Some nights, people whispered about her past, that she had once been married to a noble who vanished without a trace, that she had fought in wars disguised as a man, that she had buried 3 brothers and never wept. The rumors were plentiful, embellished, tangled, but they all circled the same truth: Hilda had lived, harder than most, and survived. You caught her eyes once, late into the night, when most of the tavern had blurred into drunken song and soft snores. There was something in them, something fierce, yes, but also tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from carrying other people's burdens for so long, you forget where yours end and theirs begin. She looked away before you could hold the gaze, but something settled in your chest, a new kind of respect, Because in a world where power was measured in blood, gold, or birth, Hilda's throne was built from something rarer: decency, strength, endurance. She didn't demand respect, she inspired it. She didn't ask for trust, she lived in a way that earned it. And if the world outside forgot how to honor women like her, this tavern never would. Hilda didn't just pour drinks, she poured stability. She poured rules into chaos, kindness into silence, and just enough danger into safety to keep it honest. You realized then that you hadn't just wandered into a tavern, you'd wandered into her kingdom. And for the first time in a long while, you felt lucky to be a subject. The tavern after sundown was a different beast entirely. It wasn't just louder, it was looser, unhinged, like it had exhaled after holding its breath all day. Boundaries blurred, voices rose, and the entire building seemed to lean a little, closer to the edge of something wild and untamed. By now, the fire had burned low, but steady, casting shadows that flickered like they had minds of their own. The air grew warmer, not just from heat, but from mood. Rules softened, ale deepened. Laughter turned into something deeper than joy, something that sounded like survival. A table near the window clattered with the sharp sound of dice against wood. It was a game of bones, crude and ancient. Two older men sat there, faces ruddy, expressions serious in a way only men can be when pretending not to care about the outcome. One accused the other of cheating, the other denied it with a smile, too confident to be clean. The stakes: a worn boot and half a cured sausage. The tension, as thick as any duel. Elsewhere, a makeshift ring of benches hosted a game more dangerous: truth or drink. The rules were simple, brutal, and brutally simple. Tell the truth or drink. The questions came fast, flung from drunk mouths with mischief in their teeth. Who had kissed a priest? Who had run from war? Who had stolen from Hilda's shelf and lived to tell about it? A traveling mason turned red before emptying his mug. A milkmaid admitted to sneaking out at night to watch the moon from a forbidden bell tower. The crowd roared, and in the corner, as if summoned by chaos, Alder took the stage, or rather, stood on the longest bench he could find. His patchwork cloak flared as he spread his arms like a prophet. His song, an ode to a goat who loved a candle and perished in the attempt, made little sense and too much noise. But his timing was perfect. The chorus had everyone howling, slapping their knees, and pretending not to cry with laughter. Ren, the boy, weaved through it all like smoke. He collected mugs, wiped spills, and dodged hands too slow to steal. You saw Hilda watching him from the bar, her face unreadable but her eyes steady. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence kept the worst impulses in check. Like a storm cloud, just distant enough to be beautiful and dangerous. The gossip flowed as easily as the ale. Whispers slid across the room, sweetened with scandal. A noblewoman traveling in disguise. A bishop caught dancing in a barn. A merchant who sold horses that disappeared at moonrise. No one asked for facts. No one offered proof. The truth wasn't currency here. Story was. And yet, beneath the humor and games, there was a strange kind of intimacy, a subtle confession buried in every boast, a sadness tucked behind every laugh. These people didn't just come here to win dice or share rumors. They came to be seen, even if only for a moment, by someone who knew how to listen. You found yourself smiling without meaning to, cheering for a game you didn't understand, laughing at jokes you'd normally judge. This place didn't ask you to be clever, or good, or wise. It asked you to join, and when you did, it welcomed you, mess and all. There were no winners here. Not really. The dice would fall where they may. The stories would shift by morning. But the memory of that night, the song, the warmth, the reckless honesty, that would last. And as you lifted your mug in a toast, you didn't hear the start of. You realized the most important truth. In the right kind of chaos, you could finally feel whole. The air thickened with the smoke of fire and the scent of cider. But beneath it pulsed something older, something quieter, desire. Not the loud kind, not always. Not the kind written in poetry or declared across balconies. No, the kind that flickers like lantern light, tentative, searching, daring to warm the spaces where language falters and looks last too long. The tavern, by this hour, had shifted into something else entirely. It wasn't a place anymore, it was a mood, a hum. Beneath the skin, a narrowing of the world to moments and movements. And in that fragile dimness, people began to lean closer. Dalia moved through the room like a whisper. She balanced mugs on one hand, dodged a drunken bard with the other, and always seemed to know who needed a refill or an escape. She wore her confidence like armor, smiling with one corner of her mouth, and letting her gaze linger just long enough to disarm the bold and confuse the hopeful. Men watched her, of course. So did women. But it wasn't about conquest. Not here. Not really. It was about attention earned, not owed. And Dalia gave it sparingly, as though her approval was a coin that had to be traded for grace, not bravado. A young stonemason tried his luck. He'd been drinking slow, listening more than talking, which set him apart already. When he handed her a carved token he'd whittled from the corner of a table, she didn't laugh. She took it without a word and slipped it into the apron at her hip. That was all the answer anyone needed. In another corner, two farmhands, one loud, one brooding, sat, shoulder to shoulder, the space between them shrinking with each game, each shared glance. They'd start with insults, then drinks, then jokes to incite for anyone else to understand. And before the night was done, one of them would offer to walk the other home, pretending it was just to make sure the path was clear. Alder, who had just finished a raucous tale about falling in love with a witch who turned out to be a fox, leaned against a post and hummed something slow, not for the crowd, for himself. His voice, stripped of performance, became a thread in the softening tapestry of the room. And as he sang, someone reached up from the bench beside him and took his hand. He looked down, surprised, and didn't pull away. These were not grand romances. No ballads would be written about them, but they mattered more because of it. They were real, flawed, flickering, unfinished. They were the kind of connections that could live in a shared laugh, a brush of fingers, a breath held between glances. Even Hilda, behind the bar, showed her own brand of tenderness. When a traveling soldier placed a small, carved charm beside his drink can, old token from a long ago, winter, she stared at it for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and turned it face down. No words, but something passed between them. Not rekindled love, not even forgiveness, just memory. And memory, in its own way, was a kind of intimacy. You, too, felt it. A stranger's shoulder brushed yours and didn't move away. A hand touched yours by accident and lingered. The space around you narrowed, not with pressure, but with invitation. And for the first time in what felt like ages, you didn't feel invisible. The lanterns above cast golden halos that danced across the wood and skin and eyes. No single story unfolded in full, but dozens began, blooming in the heat and hush of the hour. There was no promise of forever here, only the promise of now. And sometimes, now is enough. It always began the same way, quiet, small, almost invisible. A muttered word too close to offense. A spilled drink passed off as accident. A glance that lingered too long, or not long enough. In a place like this, where emotion lived just under the skin and the ale peeled it back, peace was always balanced on the edge of something sharp. Tonight, it happened near the hearth, where the warmth was thickest and the benches most crowded. Two men, one a cobbler's son with tired shoulders, the other a minor knight with more pride than coin, argued over something foolish. A card game, a misremembered song lyric, a story told out of turn. It didn't matter. Voices rose, bodies shifted. You felt it before. You saw it, the air changed. What had moments ago been laughter now had a pulse, tense, thick. You weren't the only one who noticed. Hilda moved first. She always did. Not with panic, but with precision. She stepped from behind the bar without raising her voice, eyes locked on the epicenter of the storm. Her ladle hung at her side like a weapon. Ran, without instruction, ducked under tables to clear mugs from what might soon become collateral. The knight stood. The bench tipped. The cobbler's son knocked over a stool in his rush to rise. And then that long, stretching quiet that always comes before the first blow. You held your breath. Everyone did. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't fair. It was wild, clumsy, full of too much motion and not enough purpose. Fists swung wide, not to hit, but to land somewhere, anywhere. A mug shattered. Someone yelled, not in pain, but delight. The tension snapped, and the room responded like a body recoiling from fire. It wasn't just those two. A man tried to break it up and got elbowed for his kindness. A woman threw a potato and hit someone who hadn't said a word. Alder ducked under a table, laughing, and came back up singing a battle hymn between fits of coughing. It wasn't war, it was theater, and somehow, even in the mess, there was a rhythm to it, like the tavern itself knew how to bleed without breaking. You watched Hilda weave through the chaos, separating fighters with practiced force, lifting one man by his collar and tossing him out the front door as if he weighed nothing. The knight tripped on his own pride and landed flat. The cobbler's son took a punch to the chin and kept smiling. A stool flew. A candle fell. Someone shouted about spilled stew like it was a fatal wound. And then, as quickly as it started, it ended. The fighters were winded, bruised, sweating, and half laughing, half ashamed. Hands reached out not to strike, but to help up. Coins were tossed to pay for broken mugs. A song rose to reclaim the air. Hilda stood at the center of it all, her arms folded, her breath calm. One by one, she stared down the worst of them. One by one, they looked away. Peace returned not because the rage had passed, but because the right people had decided it. With time, you exhaled. In another place, this would have been a crime. Here, it was just another verse in the tavern's song. Pain didn't last. Pride didn't either. But the memory wood carried in the sore ribs, in the bruised knuckles, in the stories retold with more drama than truth. And when the room finally settled again, you realized something strange. No one had left. Not really. They just rearranged themselves closer now. Somehow, like the fight had shaken loose, something buried. This wasn't just violence, it was a reminder that even in a place built on laughter and ale, people still carried fire, and sometimes it needed to burn. At some point in the night, the noise stopped being noise and started becoming breath. Not in the way sleep arrives in a clean bed with soft sheets, but the way it takes you in places that feel lived in. Worn down and familiar without permission. The tavern didn't fall silent, simply exhaled. The fire had settled into a quiet pulse, its orange light dancing along the walls like the memory of movement. The air no longer buzzed with arguments or laughter, but with the hushed shuffling of bodies seeking corners, benches, nooks anywhere the night might let them close their eyes and forget. You sat for a long time, still in the same place, holding a half-empty mug that had gone lukewarm, watching people settle like coals after a long burn. There was no call for last drinks, no formal announcement, just a quiet rhythm that told you the world outside had fallen away, and inside was the only space that mattered. Ren passed by you with a bundle of threadbare blankets in his arms, his step soft, as if the floor might scold him for waking it. Without speaking, he dropped one beside you. The fabric was rough, frayed at the edges, and carried the scent of ash and ale, but it was warm, and it was something given freely. You didn't head upstairs. most didn't. Those rooms were reserved for coin-heavy travelers, for merchants too proud to sleep on dirt, or for locals who knew how to trade favors without speaking of them. You stayed beneath the beams, like the others who understood that rest wasn't found in elevation, it was found in nearness. Someone curled up beside the hearth, arms wrapped around a satchel like it held a life. A woman used her cloak as a pillow and leaned against a wall, marked by hundreds of elbows and maybe a few secrets. Dalia rested in a stool, her head tilted back, one arm slung over a chair, as if she'd simply stopped mid-motion. Even Alder, the bard, had collapsed near the fire, one boot off, one eye barely open, a smile lingering from some forgotten verse. It wasn't quiet, not truly. There were snores, loud ones, shallow ones, one that sounded suspiciously like a pig. Someone talked in their sleep, whispering names into the straw floor. A bottle rolled, a rat scurried, and yet, the space felt wrapped in a kind of hush that no cathedral could replicate. Hilda didn't sleep, not right away. She stayed behind the bar, arms folded, watching her domain settle like a lioness, watching over a pack that didn't even realize they were hers to protect. You caught her eye for a moment, just a flicker, and she nodded, slow, tired, but certain. Then she sat, rested her back against the wall, and closed her eyes. Just for a minute. There was no lock on the door, no guards, no rules, really, but nothing felt safer. You laid down finally, pulling the blanket over your shoulders, letting the hard floor mold to your weight. The wood above you creaked softly. The room smelled like warmth and time, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, maybe longer, you weren't bracing for sleep. You let it come. There were no dreams that night, or if there were, they didn't stay long enough to haunt you. What stayed was stillness, the strange, unexpected comfort of bodies breathing in rhythm. Strangers, yes, but somehow closer than kin. You were alone, but not lonely, vulnerable, but untouched. Together, all of you, beneath the same roof and silence. And in that moment, as your eyes slipped shut, the world outside stopped existing. There was no road, no debt, no weight, just a fire behind your eyelids and the soft, uneven chorus of people who had also found their way here, tired, lost, full of stories, and found enough peace in this tavern to rest. Dawn didn't arrive with grace. It pushed its way in like a drunk stumbling home, loud and unwelcome. Light crept through the warped wooden shutters, casting lines across faces still soft with sleep. The tavern groaned beneath the weight of the night it had just held. The fire had long since burned to embers, and the air was heavy with the scent of ash, sweat, and something faintly sweet that clung to the straw like a memory. You blinked awake slowly, eyes dry, limbs stiff. For a moment, you forgot where you were. The ground beneath you wasn't cold, exactly, but it was unfamiliar. Then came the sound, a snore, a cough, the creak of someone stretching too far in. Their sleep hand, it all returned. The tavern, the ale, the stories, the songs, the chaos, the warmth. You sat up, dragging the blanket from your shoulders, and looked around. Others stirred too, some mumbling into the wood, some pulling cloaks tighter, some already gone without a trace. A few blinked at each other across the room with the awkward recognition of strangers who'd shared too much or too little. Wren appeared like morning mist, carrying a small broom and a bucket of something murky. He moved with purpose, quiet, but present. No complaints, no announcements. Just the rhythm of someone who knew this hour better than most. Hilda stood at the bar again, already upright, as if she hadn't slept at all. She handed out bowls of something steaming, morning stew, if one could call it that. It smelled of onions, turnips, and effort. When she passed a bowl to you, you met her eyes. There was no welcome in them, no softness, just the understanding of someone who had seen every kind of person cross her threshold and knew better than to expect thanks. You nodded. That was enough. People began to move, slow, stiff, subdued. The loudest among them had lost their voice. The boldest sat in corners, sipping broth like it might explain the night before. Someone discovered a missing shoe beneath a bench. Another laughed at a bruise they didn't remember earning. Alder, miraculously upright, tuned his lute with the tender care of someone piecing themselves back together. Dalia swept crumbs from a table with the side of her palm, eyes still swollen with sleep but moving with that same graceful precision. She wore like skin. There was no ceremony in the morning, no farewell toast or final song. People left one by one, quiet, respectful. Some offered coins, some left nothing but an empty bowl and a folded blanket, but all of them left changed. You could see it in the way they stepped through the door, slower, straighter, as if the weight they carried in had been redistributed, if not lifted. You remained a little longer, watching the light stretch across the room, catching in the dust like ghosts that had nowhere else to go. The tavern looked different in daylight. Smaller, somehow, less like a kingdom, and more like the shell of something that only truly lived after sundown. But the feeling lingered. The sense that you had stepped into something sacred, if only for a night. That you had been part of something not written in ledgers or remembered in records but real. A place that asked for nothing but presence, and gave in return something close to peace. You stepped outside into the fresh chill, the street still wet with dawn dew. The sky above Bruges was pale and cloud-smeared, promising either rain or clarity, depending on who you asked. Behind you, the door shut softly. No one called after you. No one needed to. And as your boots struck the cobbled path, you realized you were walking away not just from a tavern, but from a story. One you'd carry with you, tucked somewhere quiet, ready to be pulled out when the world got too loud. Because that's what the tavern gave you, not just a night of drink or a place to rest your head, but a truth spoken without words, that even in the mess of it all, among strangers, steam, and song, you belonged, and you always had. When you step back and look at the night you just lived in that crooked tavern of Bruges, you realize it was more than just a time slip into history. It was a mirror, smoky, distorted, but unmistakably truthful. The story began with wind-blown steps and a pounding heart. Every moment after that was a confession. You confessed your hunger, your loneliness, your longing for warmth. You bared your quiet hopes on the straw-strewn floor, in the echo of dice cast, in the gentle touch of a fellow soul. You carried your modern self into a world that held no safety nets, no couch cushions, no Wi-Fi, and you came out different. That raw night taught you that humanity doesn't need refinement to be real. It needs presence. You entered a place where walls were stained with someone else's story, spilled beer, carved initials, moments of sorrow and laughter layered invisibly in wood and smoke, and you felt the weight of time settle around your shoulders. Not like a burden, but a reminder of the shape we all fit into, the shape history fits us into. Through your first uncertain breath of that bitter ale, you learned that truth is not always sweet, but it's stronger. The drink didn't flatter you. Instead, it quieted you, stripped you down so you could listen. You recognized that sustenance isn't just about calories, it's about connection. When you dunked hard bread into a heavy stew, you ate not just the food, but the necessity of survival, your own, and the countless souls who had tasted that same bark-rind meal centuries before. And then there was Hilda. Hilda, who ruled without a crown, who wielded her ladle like a king wields a scepter. Watching her taught you that leadership is not about raising your voice. It's about steadying everyone else's. She didn't need power plaques or authority decrees. She earned respect through consistency and clarity. She was their anchor in the storm, silently strong, fiercely compassionate, never weak enough to demand or lazy enough to ignore. As the night wore on, you witnessed stories unfolding in tongues of flame, dice rolling, songs sung off-key, half-truths confessed under lantern light, glances exchanged in the dark. You realized that intimacy doesn't require romance. It requires permission to show up, to show yourself. Whether you were shouting for another drink, cheering on a scam, sharing a flirtatious dimpled smile, or holding out your hand to help someone up, you were investing in connections that didn't need explanation, just presence. When the fight erupted, it was terrifying and theatrical. It reminded you that beneath civility lies chaos, and that chaos has its own rhythm. A clash like that doesn't destroy community, it reshapes it. When bodies fell, eyes met. When laughter returned, wounds weren't forgotten, but they became shared. They became bonds across difference. They became proof that conflict, when met without malice, can knit a group tighter rather than tearing it apart. And when sleep came, it was not gentle. It was a river of voices and breaths and creaks. But in that crowded silence, you found rest. You found something precious. Permission to simply be human, among others seeing the same flawed beauty. That sleep under the beams taught you that safety isn't about walls. It's about the kind of space where you can falter and still not fall. The dawn stole in stiffly, no ceremony, no sermon. But in the morning's stew and tired glances, you recognized hope. Not vertical hope, reaching for the sky, but horizontal hopes. Someone handing you a bowl, someone touching a bruise, someone picking up your dropped blanket. You realized that community isn't built on grand gestures, but on small mercies repaid, many times over. And as you stepped back into the sunlight, the tavern faded behind you, but its imprint stayed. You walked into the modern bustle with a warmer chest, lighter shoulders, and softer voice. You carried a night of stories in your heart and a willingness to forgive the messy parts of yourself and others. What this story teaches us, and how to apply it today. 1. Embrace the mess. Life isn't neat, and neither are we. We're a collection of contradictory impulses, love and anger, charity and greed, hope and fear. The tavern held all of that, without apology. It reminds you that the messy parts aren't flaws to hide their threads in your tapestry. You don't need perfection to belong to. Leadership is quiet. You saw Hilda hold the room together with gestures, glances, and hard-earned presence. Real leadership isn't about being loud. It's about being consistent, fair, and compassionate. It's about making space for others to show up as themselves. 3. Connection over convenience. There was no app that linked tavern souls that night, just bodies, breath, and shared time. That's the kind of connection we often lose in the digital age. It doesn't require a screen. It requires showing up and staying. 4. Conflict is part of community. That brawl didn't break the tavern. It became a shared legend. Conflict, faced with empathy and accountability, can heal and bind people more tightly than agreement ever could. Avoiding conflict isn't peace, it's stasis. 5. Sleep in shared spaces. You slept shoulder to shoulder with strangers, and you slept better than you had in months. We undervalue the simple power of closeness. Presence breaks isolation, even in silence. 6. Dawn is a promise. Morning came without ceremony, but it always came. Even when the night was long and brutal, the dawn asked nothing from you but the courage to stand. Every fresh day is a gift. Seize it. 7. Memory matters more than stories. Tomorrow, part of that night will slip away, but the feeling stays. Your chest expands, your voice softens, your eyes meet someone else a little easier. That feeling is the real story, not the facts. And that memory shapes who you are. Challenge for you, the viewer. What part of your life feels like a crooked tavern? Messy, loud, unpredictable? Where do you hide your voice, your vulnerability, or your warmth? I invite you to explore that space. Step into it not for perfection, but for presence. Choose a moment today to connect over a meal. Listen to a story someone else carries. Appreciate conflict as part of community. Or simply be present without performance. Join the conversation now. I want to hear from you. What spoke most to you in this story? Was it the warmth of belonging, the power in silent leadership, the reckoning after a fight, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Let's learn from each other's lives the way our medieval tavern souls shared a single night. Support the channel if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you smile. Subscribe to the channel. Every new subscriber gives me fuel to continue exploring these hidden moments where history meets heart. I'm committed to bringing you more stories that feel less like history lessons and more like shared memories. Thank you for being here. I can't wait to see where our next journey takes us.